Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Conspiracy Farm, where we don't start the conspiracies, we just add the water. And now, your host of the most state-of-the-art, most informed podcast on the interweb, I present to you Pat Miletich and Jeffrey Wilson. Ladies and gentlemen, are you ready for war?
Conspiracy Farm. Go. Check it out.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. We are off to the races for another episode for the archives of the Conspiracy Farm. Jeffrey Wilson, as always, riding shotgun with my boy, UFC Hall of Famer Pat Miletich. How we doing today, champ?
I am in a splendid mood, sir, and I am ready to roll. We have a lot of great questions to ask our guest, who's been on several times and always brings a great deal of knowledge and some shocking knowledge, actually, many times.
Yeah, it's always pretty shocking when we get her on, but she's always out there doing the diligent work, man. She is a warrior. You know, she is really putting a lot on the line. But before we get started, support the farm, support the sponsors, theconspiracyfarm.com, archived episodes, plenty of sponsors with incredible products. And, I'm really stoked that she's taking the time out to talk with us today. Just going to give a quick bio. If you haven't heard the show before, Dilyana is a Bulgarian journalist and Middle East correspondent. She's published a series of reports on weapons supplies to terrorists in Syria and Iraq. In December of 2016, while reporting on the Battle of Aleppo, she discovered and filmed underground warehouses full of heavy weapons with Bulgaria as their country of origin. They were used by al-Nusra Front, the al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria, which is designated as a terrorist organization by the UN. Diplomatic documents which were leaked to her revealed that these weapons were just a small part of a covert international weapons shipment network via 350 diplomatic flights for armaments of terrorists in the Middle East and Africa. Wow. And we're going to get into it. Dilyana, how are you doing today, ma'am?
I'm fine. Thank you for having me again on your program.
Well, absolutely. You are always, always welcome because, again, you're one of the few journalists out there actually doing journalism. But how's your summer been? I mean, how's life been treating you?
I've been investigating again weapon supplies to terrorists, this time to Yemen, to the Islamic State in Yemen.
Wow. So, again, nothing has changed. Like we just said kind of in the bio, she really kind of blew the lid off of this story about, weapons, NATO weapons being found facilitating arming terrorists in Syria. And as I've even seen, weapons have gone to Afghanistan. Weapons are going to Yemen, like you said. Like I said, Dilyana, man, if you can go on and research her, which I've obviously done a little bit, having her on a few times, she's really out there doing the work. And a particular video that really has stuck with me is you were in, I believe, Brussels, possibly. You confronted the U.S. Assistant Secretary of Health, Robert Kadlec. And I'm jumping the gun here to some of the bioweapon stuff, which we're going to get into. But you were basically telling him there's plenty of evidence out there about these bioweapons facilities, biomedical facilities, laboratories in 25 different countries all throughout the world, Eurasia, Africa, Europe. And they tried to kick you out, and they tried to escape in this elevator, and you hounded them in the elevator. That's journalism, man. That's journalism.
Actually, they kicked me out.
Yeah, they kicked you out of the parliament.
And it was very disturbing because I went to cover a conference about biological weapons, and I asked questions, which was the right thing to do. I mean, this was a conference on biological weapons, and they just didn't like my questions and kicked me out of the parliament, which was very, very humiliating for them, not for me.
No, exactly, because, you had the evidence. But before we get to the bio stuff, like you said, we're finding out that as things sort of close down in Syria, but there is still reports that weapons are still kind of going to Syria, and there are still conflicts in Syria, you're now hearing about weapons being funneled through European countries, specifically in Serbia. A Serbia factory called Krusik, you're finding, is shipping weapons to places in the Middle East, Qatar, and it's winding up in Yemen. Talk to us a little bit about the new weapons trade facilitation that you've now found out coming through Serbia.
Recently, I anonymously received explosive documents from the Serbian state-owned arms manufacturer Krusik, including emails, internal memos, contracts, photos, delivery schedules, and packing lists with lot numbers of weapons and their buyers. Among the leaked documents, I also received scanned passports of arms dealers and government officials from the United States, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates.
Wow.
They visited the Serbian arms factory to purchase weapons. I'm talking about mortar shells and rockets. I'm talking about heavy weapons on behalf of the US government, Saudi Defense Ministry, and the Emirati Army. Some of these weapons, however, have ended up with terrorists in Yemen, and I'll explain how I found this out. After I received all these documents, I was shocked because they were about 3 million pieces of mortar shells and rocket, and I wanted to discover the location to which these tons of heavy weapons had been shipped, and I traced back 2 particular lots of Serbian mortar shells whose identification marks were clearly visible in Islamic State videos and photos in Yemen. I used the documents that were leaked to me from the Serbian arms factory Krusik to find out who had originally ordered and purchased these 2 lots of weapons. In the first case, what I found out was that the buyer was a private American company which purchased these 82mm mortar shells in the hands of Islamic State terrorists in Yemen on behalf of the US government. And according to the documents, this was under a US federal contract for the delivery of non-US standard weapons to Afghanistan. However, the same lot of weapons appeared in this recent video of the Islamic State in Yemen. In the second case, I found that another lot of Serbian weapons featured in Islamic State photos in Yemen was purchased by Saudi Arabia, by the Saudi Ministry of Defense. And the exporter from Serbia was a private company, private Serbian company, represented by the Serbian Vice Prime Minister's father. So it was here we're talking about corruption on very high levels.
Right.
Many governments. Now it is not only the US government, also the Serbian government, the Saudi government, and all the countries involved.
And you're able to even track down some of the airways, Kalita Air, Atlas Air. You're able through Flight Manifest to find out that these weapons in this particular case was going to Qatar.
I found out in the documents the existence of a secret U.S. Special Operations Command unit codenamed Task Force Smoking Gun, which has been deployed in Croatia since 2017. And this Task Force Smoking Gun has been tasked with diverting tons of arms and ammunition from Europe via Qatar, Al-Udeid military airbase, to Syria. And these weapons were transported on trucks from Serbia to Croatia, from where they were transported on American Pentagon chartered flights to the Middle East. And the 2 air companies which were chartered for these flights with weapons were Kalita Air and Atlas Air. These are 2 private American air companies.
Are flying overhead right now, sounds like.
Oh, yes. This is not Kalita Air or Atlas Air, but these 2 companies, they have very lucrative contracts, federal contracts for the delivery of diplomatic cargo and also sensitive cargo, including narcotics, for the U.S. government and for the Pentagon.
So how does this tie into, we caught wind from some of my connections as far as the CIA programs or American programs version of arming ISIS and al-Nusra was ceased by the Trump administration, but obviously there's still actors within potentially the agency and the Pentagon, as you mentioned, who are facilitating continued arms shipments into Syria, Iraq, and Yemen, of course.
All these documents, they prove that the weapons supplies have never ended and that they continue to this date. So no matter what officials announce and the Trump administration claims, it is not true. The flow of weapons continue to the Middle East, to different war zones, including Yemen, Afghanistan, Syria. Nothing has changed. Just probably the routes have changed because since 2017 they changed the location, this arms depot in Europe from where the weapons are shipped. Now it is Croatia. Before it was Baku, the Azeri capital, from where the Azeri state-run company Silkway Airlines transported all these weapons to different locations using diplomatic flights. Now the same is via American carriers, but they carry out diplomatic flights. So actually nothing has changed. There is just change in the locations, in the routes, but the players are the same. Nothing has changed. The scheme is the same.
Well, and you have, like you said, our good friends at Silkway Airlines being utilized now by Alliance Techno Systems, who are doing their role shipping weapons to Afghanistan. So it's everywhere. It's crazy.
That's what I was going to ask, if Silkway was still being used or if they had shipped or moved completely away from them.
Actually, you're absolutely right. They continue using Silkway. Now they are using a subsidiary which is called Silkway West Airlines, but it is basically the same. It is again a subsidiary of Silkway, and nothing has changed. The diplomatic flights with weapons continue to war zones around the world.
And Silkway is being that Azerbaijani airline that we've spoken about on previous episodes.
Yes, it is an Azerbaijan state-run company, and they use their status being a state-run company for diplomatic flights, which is very scandalous for me because the whole state of Azerbaijan abuses the power that the Azeri embassy has in different countries. They request diplomatic clearance for flights with weapons. Of course, they receive this diplomatic clearance, and this is how the scheme works because diplomatic flights are exempt of checks, inspections, and air bills.
And these wars in Syria and Yemen reportedly are for basically regime change and to run Saudi pipelines through Syria out to the Mediterranean Sea and then the Gulf of Aden through Yemen, if I'm correct.
In Yemen, what I discovered was shocking because it turns out that while the U.S. government officially is fighting the Islamic State in Syria, it is secretly supplying arms to the same terrorists in Yemen. How exactly they divert the weapons from Afghanistan to Yemen? This is another question, and this is a topic for a topic of another investigation. But the Pentagon and all the American private contractors and the Serbian arms factory that manufactured the weapons, they all refuse to comment on these facts, and yet I have had no comment by any of the parties involved.
Of course not. My goodness, why would they want to keep their money stopped from flowing? You know, you lost your job, reporting on this when you found out the weapons in Aleppo. How do people take this kind of information in your neck of the woods? Your friends, your family members, or people you hang out with, or just in your area over there? What do they think about this?
This is very painful question because people, not only in Bulgaria but also in Serbia, after I published the last investigation, many people in Serbia contacted me. They supported me morally, but they are very afraid to speak up because we are small countries, and I guess it is not much different from the West, by the way, because I was also contacted by Western journalists, and some of them told me that they could not publish anything because they are afraid that they will lose their job. And I sent documents to very world famous journalists and media organizations. They wanted to investigate this story, and they didn't publish anything, which is very indicative of the gravity of the scheme, and also of the dependence of all journalists who claim to be investigative journalists. They serve their governments, not the interest of the public.
Well, and again, Smedley Butler said war is a racket, and when you upset this apple cart, you're talking about multi-billions, if not trillions of dollars. And because always, honestly, in these war-torn areas, you're dealing in other trades as well. There's always people. There's always people's body parts. Unfortunately, I mean, this is a very dark network that it's just so crazy because it's just on its face. It's just inverting reality. They're telling us they're trying to stop terror and they're trying to spread democracy, but in fact, they're putting weapons in the hands of these people. It's just on its face, just insane. It's hard to get your mind around sometimes.
Yes, this is the sad reality because people can't imagine that this is possible. But if you think logically, even without having all these hundreds of documents, if you think logically, how is that possible? The Islamic State, for instance, it consists of foreign fighters from all around the world.
Yeah.
How is that possible? They were almost destroyed in Syria. How come that these terrorists appeared in Yemen? And from where do they take their weapons? Given the fact that I'm talking about official statements, everybody fights them. Then from where do they take these weapons? There are not so many options. I mean, not so many borders. For instance, in Syria, the Islamic State, or let's talk about the Al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria, al-Nusra Front, that are now fighting in Syria. Right. They are almost closed. I mean, they're enclosed. It is an area which is circled by Syrian government forces, Russian forces, almost from all sides. They have only one border, which is the Turkish border. So it is absolutely logical. From where do they take weapons? Through Turkey. There is no other option. The same in Yemen. The Islamic State, all of them claim that they fight the Islamic State. Saudi Arabia, the United States also claims that they fight the Islamic State in Yemen. But the Islamic State in Yemen is very powerful now, and they are well equipped. And if you watch their propaganda videos, you can see them heavily armed with very professional equipment, which is not possible to happen if some powerful country or government hasn't supplied them.
Yeah, just crazy. Pat, jump in, man. My brain's melting.
Well, I mean, look, it's disheartening to learn that the weapon shipments continue, that the war rages on still, no matter what administration is in. It's whether it's no matter what president it is, it's sad, and we have to shine a light on this stuff. We have to make people aware of it, and whether it's we started out with the Clinton State Department. I remember all the way back, gosh, I can't even remember how long it's been now, seeing John McCain on CNN with what they termed or coined them as the Free Syrian Army.
Yeah.
And I immediately called one of my intelligence friends and said, dude, seriously, what are we doing? And, he filled me in on a lot of that. So it's just, it's disheartening to know that it's continuing. And I'm glad that Dilyana has the guts to expose this. And honestly, Dilyana, I mean, have you had emails or messages on your phone or anything like that, where people have actually threatened you?
No, they don't work that way. But what happened was that when I published the last part of the investigation about how the Serbian vice prime minister's father exported weapons to Saudi Arabia on papers, which appeared in the hands of the Islamic State in Yemen. Somebody tagged the Serbian vice prime minister to a post with a link to this article, and literally 30 minutes later, my website was subjected to DDoS attack, and it lasted a few hours. My hosting provider coped with this attack. The site was back, and then again a second. It was DDoS for a second time for about few hours. So we had to block all Serbian IPs or Serbia as a whole from accessing the website. And the people who ordered this DDoS attack, they actually achieved their goal, namely to prevent Serbian people from reading this article and knowing what their government has been doing. But luckily, somebody in Serbia had saved the PDF of this article, and it's very fast. So they couldn't hide this information from the Serbian people. And it became a huge scandal in Serbia because this is a high-ranking official with arms sales to a war zone. And terrorists in war zone. This is a huge scandal there.
Well, even though you said they haven't come at you in that way, just make me feel better and let everybody know that you have no intentions of hurting yourself. You have no intentions of driving off a cliff or hanging yourself or anything like that. Please do that for me. A little insurance policy.
I want to live a very long life and to investigate more and more stories like this, so I have no intention to hurt myself or anybody.
There you go.
I appreciate your humor.
Yeah, it's for the archives, ladies and gentlemen. Keep your hands off Dilyana. What were you going to say, Pat?
No, I was gonna go back to, we had talked about the disappearance of a massive number of children out of Yemen hospitals, and the parents were being interviewed and saying that they had no idea where their children had gone. They brought them in. What was the outbreak? Was it cholera, or what was the outbreak in Yemen?
Yes,
due to the war and the water supply being disrupted, and then the children were just literally disappearing out of the hospital by the hundreds.
The fact is that nobody cares about the children in Yemen. I can't imagine that international bodies and organizations, world organizations such as the United Nations, can't do anything, can't stop this war. I myself sent a letter to the United Nations and to Interpol because they have special programs for arms trafficking. They have such units which are supposed to investigate arms trafficking, and they never got back to me. This is not important for them. I sent links to this investigation, which is based entirely on hundreds of documents, also leaked passports. So if they want to, they can interrogate all these people and they really can make a change, and
They just don't want to. Yeah.
and stop this war in Yemen, but nobody cares. I was very sad when I watched this child, Greta, at the United Nations, and it became a huge scandal around the world. No matter if you like her or not, or this is not the issue for me now. I don't mention Greta because I want to bring the topic about climate change.
Right.
Not at all. I was sad because nobody will invite Yemeni children. I saw many photos of Yemeni children with placards reading, "Stop the war in Yemen, we want to study." These children are simply ignored. You can see hundreds of photos, gut-wrenching photos of starving children, literally dying from hunger, babies, malnourished, pregnant mothers who have nothing to eat, and nobody cares. And this is all because the main players in Yemen are the United States, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. And this is a proxy war between Iran and all these three countries.
Yeah.
And the result is this. In Yemen in particular, every 10 minutes, a child dies from preventable diseases.
Yeah. And we know that there were, approximately 17,000 children's organs harvested in a 4-year period in Syria alone. So we have a pretty good idea, unfortunately, what's happening to a lot of these children that are disappearing over in Yemen. So it's shocking, and it needs to have a light shown on it. And you're exactly right. You know, the whole Greta sideshow at the UN was in my mind, you know, it was complete and utter propaganda. And we definitely need children from Yemen at the UN speaking on this, because it's an absolute nightmare over there for them.
Unfortunately, there is nobody who will invite them, and we can only see these children with their placards from the battlefield in Yemen, but we will never see these children at the United Nations or other international organizations.
It's something we brought up here, and it's different for everybody, but I think a large reason why that is allowed to play out like that, and we don't care, because it's not our kid. The lack of empathy for other people's suffering, whether it's Palestine or Syria or these places where literally the U.S. and her allies, and I mean, I love this country, so it's not even about that, but our government is doing horrible, horrible things in our names and inflicting just incredible human rights abuses and borderline genocide and organ harvesting and trafficking. I mean, it's just insane what's happening. And like you said, which is really unfortunate, and we talk about it also on the show, how the mainstream media is just in the pocket. It's just a mouthpiece of the state, essentially. There's nobody willing to risk what you've risked to get the real story out, because they're just covering the butt of this kind of operation, which I said is, talking trillions of dollars.
Because these journalists, I think actually journalism nowadays is an empty word. I don't see any use of journalism anymore, because when I received so many messages from Western journalists, and then they made excuses. For instance, my editor gave me to work on another story, but I'll call you later. Of course, they never called me later. Or please send us these documents, we will investigate. There was a case with a British broker who mediated an arms deal with weapons for Syria between the US government and this Serbian state-owned arms factory. And the journalists to whom I sent documents, of course, never published a word, because it is not, we are not supposed to read that a British company has been involved in arms trafficking to Syria along with the US government. And because now there are no moderate rebels anymore in Syria. Actually, I think, in my opinion, and from my experience on the ground in Syria, there never had been such term like moderate rebels, because moderate rebels can be heavily armed with 122 millimeter Grad rockets. So anyways, now there are only terrorists in Syria. So if they publish that the arms trafficking to Syria continues from Europe, they must confess that now the U.S. government is arming terrorists.
Well, and to go along with the whole inversion of freaking reality, I'm like losing my mind over here. People who say that, people who are engaged in this and have been for decades, but they're walking around free and continuing to do this just right in our faces in plain sight. But people like you who say something about it, you get fired. People like Julian Assange, they demonize truth, which is just, again, just is so mind-boggling because so much darkness is going down. And it's like you said, it's preventable if we would just realize it's going on, I think.
Talking about Julian Assange, this is the most shameful and outrageous thing I've ever read about, and I can't even imagine what he's going through now, and his family, and WikiLeaks now, because he was supported by all Western media. He provided truthful documents, and he was on the cover of many of these news organizations. All of a sudden, he became inconvenient, and they literally demonized him and forgot him. And it is something that shocked me a lot, because if this can happen in a Western country such as the United Kingdom, one of the greatest democracies, what can we expect in general?
It's a dangerous precedent for sure. I mean, in the light of so much evil, it only makes sense to demonize truth, quite frankly. I mean, they don't want the light shined on any of this. Like I was talking to Pat, and we've talked about the Epstein thing. People think as if that's not bad enough. Human trafficking. I mean, he was involved in all of this stuff: drugs, guns, people's bodies parts, arms, washing these billions of dollars through these financial institutions. I mean, there was so much more to it. And it's all kind of in the lane of all of this that we're talking about, this vast network.
I couldn't agree more with you, and I wish people be more compassionate. And if these are not their children, these are somebody else's children. These are children. These are children, but nobody cares. And unfortunately, the life of children in the Middle East, for instance, or Africa, is not equal to the life of children in other parts of the world.
Right. Yeah. So, what do you think? What do you think is keeping? I mean, obviously, Russia, China, other nations are doing their best to arm combatants on the other side of the trenches. What's it going to take for this potentially to blow up into a real, not only regional conflict, massive conflict, where American forces are involved, or other British forces, other European forces, but also Russia actually entering, and we know that some Russian forces have been killed in Syria. I mean, does this, we're really walking a fine line here, potentially to a global war, are we not?
I don't expect in the near future such a global war, because all these global or world powers, they know their interests and they follow their interests, and if they had to clash with each other, for instance, in Syria, they would have done it so far. But now
the money train stops when that happens, huh?
Yeah. That's what I'm thinking. The global economy is here. They're so economically interdependent. These symmetrical wars, one side on this side, one side on the other, I think is kind of passé. They utilize kind of economic means, sanctions, and more symmetrical warfare, almost like Dilyana getting hit on her computer. There's other ways for them to wage war now and still, have a pretty hefty impact on countries' economies, etc.
I haven't been in Syria since I was fired. Actually, I was fired in order to to stop me from getting back to Syria to continue this story. And I can't say what's the reality now on the ground in Syria, but hopefully I will return and I'll keep you posted about the
Absolutely.
situation.
Well, talking about, I don't know if you've heard of this gentleman. I'd kind of just caught one of myself. Have you heard of a guy named Victor Bout?
Yes, Victor Bot, yes.
Yeah.
We have many Victor Bots now.
Yeah, no, it's funny that's absolutely true. I mean, if you're familiar with who Barry Seal was basically the American version of a Victor Bout, and I'm sure they're everywhere. But Victor Bout was a Tajikistani, if I'm saying that right. Basically, they called him the Merchant of Death. He was supposedly the inspiration of Lord of War with Nicolas Cage. He was basically this big arms dealer that, to my understanding, even had a couple of contracts with the U.S. government to deliver arms in Iraq. But essentially, he was cutting too much into this network's profits. His contract prices were way lower, and he was willing to take less money. And so they wound up basically catching him up in a sting in Thailand and arresting him. And I think he's doing about 20, 30 years in an American jail. But yeah, I just found that interesting because there's so many of those now. And from what I can understand, I mean, he's even in interviews echoing what we're saying here. If people only knew the truth, they're coming after and demonizing people like me, when in fact there's so much bigger fish that are involved in this network that are doing way more than I am. But even the whatever profits he was cutting into, they just weren't having it, and he wound up becoming, a patsy, if you will.
And we'll never hear about them. What I discovered in the leaked documents was that private contractors have been commissioned by the U.S. government or Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates to transport and to smuggle these weapons. And this is a tactic, or this the use of private contractors is common for secret services when they carry out clandestine illegal operations abroad. And this is the case, but you will never hear about these people. I published their names and passports if they are real. I mean, I'm not sure if these are fake passports or if these are real passports, but nobody will investigate them because the United Nations or Interpol, they're useless. It turns out that they just they're international organizations which do nothing. And I'm very thankful for giving me the opportunity to tell my story and to talk about arms trafficking, because if we can't stop these crimes, I don't know who else can. I mean, journalists.
And it's even more frustrating because, like you said, and you've mentioned, and we've even mentioned, these organizations like the UN, refugee, these people that are supposed to be protecting kids, they're oftentimes
CFR, NATO, Trilateral Commission, all these people, how are they involved? Yeah.
Well, no, I mean, they're always involved. The UN, who's supposed to be protecting kids, they're some of the big ones funneling, trafficking the kids. Or here in the States, this company called the CPS, it's a Child Protection Services. They've been found to be involved in trafficking children. They're supposed to be protecting children who are victims of abuse. And we find out all too often that these heads of these companies or these organizations are involved in the very same stuff they're supposed to be preventing. It's crazy. Absolutely crazy. Well, all right. Before we let you slide, we do want to talk to you about, because like I said in the beginning, you confronted the U.S. Assistant Secretary of Health, Robert Kadlec, back in the day and were kicked out of the parliamentary proceedings by forcing him to admit, which you already knew through documents, of these U.S. biological weapons laboratories all throughout Eurasia and Africa, 25 different locations. Talk to us about some of the news you found out about that, and if you don't mind, kind of tie that into something you brought up last time, which just blew my mind, ladies and gentlemen. Stop sending your blood into that 23andMe or whatever, because as Dilyana's found out and we've learned about, they're able to create genetic-specific bioweapons. Talk to us a little bit about some of the facilities you found in genetic-specific warfare.
What I specifically did was to go to Georgia, where one of these Pentagon biolaboratories is located, and what I found there was that U.S. diplomats I say diplomats because they are scientists, military scientists with diplomatic status. They have been involved in the trafficking of human blood and frozen human blood and pathogens for a secret military program in Georgia. And I approached one of these diplomats or military scientists who turned out to be entomologists. Forgive me if I don't pronounce this word correctly, but this is a scientist who examines insects. And this man is worked. He was at that point deputy director of the Pentagon unit in the laboratory in Georgia, and he is specialized in examining insects and the diseases that these insects can transmit. And I approached him and asked him what he was doing inside this laboratory and why he was driving a diplomatic car. And he said, he lied to me. He said that he worked for the U.S. Embassy, but according to the documents that I had, he was the deputy director of this Pentagon unit in the laboratory. Later on, he returned to the United States after I published this documentary. I don't know if this is because I shed light on the program or because his assignment was over, but it is very scary because nobody knows what exactly happens inside these military facilities and laboratories and what exactly viruses and programs they have been examining. But many of the programs that they were working on were about possible use of insects as biological weapons. And they say this is to prevent the use of such insects as biological weapons, but this is a dual use. And these programs can be defensive, but it can be also offensive. Nobody knows. If they examine how insects can transmit genetically modified viruses in order to save humanity, this means that they also have the technology to genetically modified viruses that can be transmitted by insects. And it's very dangerous. And I tried to ask, but I was expelled from the park.
We know that mosquitoes have been weaponized, right?
Mosquitoes, also ticks, which is very scary because you can't protect yourselves from ticks or from mosquitoes. It is just not possible. And your body is exposed to all these insects and you can't do anything. And unfortunately, when I published this story, again, Western journalists either ignore it or just commented that it was conspiracy theory.
Jiminy Christmas.
It's, as usual, always conspiracy theory.
Always.
Right.
Wow. So much to chew on, ladies and gentlemen. So much to chew on. I mean, the world's on fire. There's a lot of beautiful stuff going on in the world, too, but my goodness. These wicked SOBs, man. People just, we say it all the time. People just don't, the layperson just does not fathom the depth of the evil that is taking place right in front of them. Because they're just, I don't know, they don't have time to look into this stuff. And it's a testament to their humanity, in my opinion. Like, no, people can never be that bad. But they are. Not all of them, but man, the people that are running stuff are putting down some pretty wicked stuff.
I wish to say something more positive, but I can't.
Yeah, we got to take the good with the bad and always try to, think as positive as possible. But, it is tough, man. When you do shows like this and research like this and the work you do, and you really are, face to face with, the darkness of humanity, it becomes hard to see the light. So hopefully, you and Pat, we just try to surround ourselves with loved ones and friends and try to stay in the light. But ladies and gentlemen, if you want to find out more about our good friend Dilyana, check her out, dilyana.bg. That's dilyana.bg. It's her website. Tells a lot of her special reports, a lot of her work. You can read a little bit about her. Anything else before we let you go? Because I know it's late there in Bulgaria. You're 8 hours ahead. Sorry to keep you up so late. Anything else you want to close with?
I want to thank you so much again and again for giving me the opportunity to talk about all this. And I know that it is hard to say something positive, but the fact that there are people like you there, and I can speak freely from my country to you on the other part of the world, means that not everything is lost, and there is still hope, and we together can change this world, and we can together make a difference. Thank you so much.
I do believe you are correct. Thank you, Dilyana. Patrick, good to talk to you.
Thank you,
once again.
Dilyana, and we will keep the First Amendment alive over here so that we can express our disappointment and our views, hopefully indefinitely.
Without a doubt. Dilyana Gaytanzheiva, dilyana.bg. It's always a pleasure. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Peace and so much love. Stay tuned. There will always be more.